A forbidden American novel in a South African prison cell changed the mind of the man who would free a nation. One book, smuggled past censors, secretly shaped Nelson Mandela's fight for freedom. Here's how John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath became the hidden blueprint for dismantling apartheid. Picture this: Robben Island, 1960s. 7 miles off the coast of Cape Town lies the most notorious prison in apartheid South Africa. The world's most famous political prisoner, Nelson Mandela, sits in his cramped cell, desperately searching for hope in a heavily censored prison library. The rules were suffocating. Books with red in the title automatically banned, even if it was Little Red Riding Hood, because the color was associated with socialism and communism. Political works, absolutely forbidden. War novels, rejected because they might incite violence. Even H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds was turned away simply because it contained the word war in its title. But somehow, nestled between approved romance novels and safe historical texts, one book slipped through the ideological net, a story about displaced American farmers that would revolutionize how Nelson Mandela understood oppression, resistance, and the very nature of human dignity. This wasn't just any book. This was John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath, a novel so powerful that it would secretly transform a freedom fighter's philosophy and ultimately help reshape an entire nation's approach to justice. To understand the magnitude of this discovery, we need to grasp the reality of intellectual life on Robben Island. The prison, dubbed the university by its political inmates, housed some of South Africa's most brilliant minds, lawyers, doctors, teachers, and activists who had dared to challenge apartheid. The library system was a cruel joke designed to provide the illusion of rehabilitation while maintaining strict ideological control. Each section of the prison had its own small library, staffed by prisoners themselves. Ahmed Kathrada, Mandela's close comrade and later a cabinet minister in the post-apartheid government, served as librarian in B section, where he, Mandela, and about 24 other high-profile political prisoners were held. Kathrada had to walk a dangerous tightrope. As librarian, he was responsible to the prison authorities for maintaining ideological purity in the collection, but as a freedom fighter, he was desperately seeking materials that could nurture hope and strategic thinking among his fellow prisoners. Every book that made it onto those shelves had passed through multiple layers of scrutiny by prison guards, wardens, and government censors. In this suffocating environment, Mandela discovered John Steinbeck's masterpiece. Published in 1939, The Grapes of Wrath tells the story of the Joad family, Oklahoma sharecroppers driven from their ancestral land by a combination of environmental disaster and economic exploitation during the Great Depression. Forced to abandon everything they had ever known, they joined the desperate westward migration to California, hoping for work, dignity, and a chance to rebuild their shattered lives. The prison censors, focused on detecting obvious communist propaganda and African nationalist materials, saw only another American novel about historical events. They completely missed the revolutionary fire burning within its pages, the systematic critique of capitalism, and the profound meditation on resistance and human solidarity that would speak so directly to Mandela's situation. What Mandela discovered in the Joad story was nothing less than a mirror reflecting the experience of black South Africa under apartheid. The parallels were so striking, they seemed almost prophetic, as if Steinbeck had somehow foreseen the systematic oppression that would be formalized in South Africa a decade after his novel's publication. Consider the opening scenes. The Joad family, who had worked their land for generations, are suddenly informed that they must leave, not because they had failed as farmers, not because they had broken any laws, but because larger economic forces, banks, corporations, mechanization, had determined their presence was no longer profitable. The tractors arrive, driven by neighbors who apologize even as they destroy the Joad's home, explaining that they too are just trying to survive in an impossible system. For Mandela, reading this while imprisoned for fighting apartheid, the resonance was overwhelming. The Group Areas Act of 1950 had done precisely this to millions of black South Africans. Families who had lived in areas like Sophiatown, District 6, and countless rural communities for generations were suddenly declared illegal. Their homes were bulldozed, their communities scattered, not because of anything they had done, but because white economic and political interests required their removal. The novel's depiction of migrant labor camps in California matched Mandela's intimate knowledge of South Africa's compound system. Black South Africans were forced into hostels and townships, separated from their families for months or years at a time, working in mines and farms under brutal conditions for wages that barely sustained life. Like Steinbeck's migrants, they were essential to the economy, but treated as expendable, human resources to be exploited and discarded. Mandela later wrote, "I found many similarities between the plight of the migrant workers in that novel and our own laborers and farm workers." But this understated his reaction. Fellow prisoner Mac Mahara later recalled Mandela becoming visibly emotional while discussing certain passages, particularly those dealing with family separation and the psychological warfare used to break workers' spirits. The novel showed Mandela that the mechanisms of oppression were universal: create artificial scarcity, pit oppressed groups against each other, use law enforcement to protect property over people, and maintain the myth that individual failure, rather than systemic exploitation, explains poverty and displacement. Mandela's connection to the grapes of wrath wasn't merely intellectual, it was viscerally personal. Born in the rural village of Mvezo in the Transkei, he had grown up witnessing the destruction of traditional African agriculture and the forced transformation of his people into migrant laborers. His own father, Gadla Henry Mufakaniiswa, had been a local chief and councillor to the Thembu regent, but colonial policies systematically undermined traditional authority and land tenure, forcing even prominent African families into economic dependence on white-controlled systems. Mandela had watched his community's young men leave for the mines and cities, returning broken by dangerous work and family separation, if they returned at all. When Steinbeck described the Jod family's anguish at leaving their ancestral burial grounds, Mandela thought of his own people's connection to the land. African traditional religion is fundamentally tied to place. Ancestors are buried in specific locations, rituals must be performed in particular spots, and identity is inseparable from geography. The forced removals didn't just displace bodies, they severed spiritual connections that had sustained communities for centuries. The novel's most heartbreaking scenes involve the dissolution of family structures under economic pressure. Pa Joad's authority crumbles as he can no longer provide for his family. The younger generation loses respect for traditional ways that no longer offer protection. Extended family networks, which had provided security for generations, are scattered by the demands of individual survival. Mandela recognized this pattern from his own experience. Apartheid policies deliberately targeted African family structures, knowing that broken families produced compliant workers. The migrant labor system, the Group Areas Act, the influx control laws, all were designed to prevent stable African communities from forming, because stable communities might organize and resist. Reading about Ma Joad's fierce determination to keep her family together despite impossible circumstances, Mandela thought of the African women he had known, his own mother, his first wife Evelyn, and especially Winnie, who was already enduring harassment and imprisonment for her political activities. These women somehow maintained family bonds across enormous distances and obstacles, becoming the backbone of resistance communities. The political prisoners of Robben Island had transformed their brutal incarceration into what they proudly called the university. In the lime quarry, where they were forced to perform back-breaking labor, in the exercise yards during their brief recreation periods, in whispered conversations after lights out, these men created one of the most extraordinary educational environments in history. Mandela shared his discovery of the grapes of wrath with his fellow prisoners, including Walter Sisulu, the wise elder statesman of the ANC, Ahmed Kathrada, the brilliant organizer, Govan Mbeki, the intellectual father of Thabo Mbeki, and dozens of other leaders from across South Africa's liberation movements. They discussed the book using coded language, knowing that guards were always listening for signs of political activity. The discussions were sophisticated and urgent. These weren't academic debates but strategic planning sessions disguised as literary criticism. How could Steinbeck's insights be applied to their situation? What lessons could be extracted for the liberation struggle they would rejoin upon their release? Several key themes emerged from their clandestine seminars. The myth of individual solutions. Steinbeck had shown how the American dream's emphasis on individual success actually served to mask systemic exploitation. Tom Joad's initial belief that hard work and individual integrity would be enough was systematically destroyed by his encounters with a rigged system. The prisoners recognized this pattern in apartheid propaganda, which blamed black poverty on individual failings rather than acknowledging structural oppression, the power of collective organization. The novel's most hopeful scenes involve workers coming together, the impromptu camp communities, the strike organizing, the mutual aid networks. Even when specific organizing efforts fail, Steinbeck shows how collective action builds consciousness and solidarity that transcends immediate defeats. This reinforced the prisoners' commitment to mass organization over individual heroism. The importance of narrative control. One of the novel's most subtle insights concerns how oppressive systems maintain themselves through controlling stories. The migrants are told they're lucky to have any work at all, that economic conditions are natural rather than manufactured, that their suffering is temporary and justified. Mandela and his comrades recognized how apartheid used similar narrative strategies, and they began developing counter-narratives that would later become central to the liberation struggle. Economic and political liberation as inseparable. Unlike many political movements that focused primarily on formal rights, Steinbeck showed how political freedom without economic justice was meaningless. The migrants had the theoretical right to travel and seek work, but practical economic constraints made those rights hollow. This insight would profoundly influence the ANC's post-apartheid economic policies. Maharaj later recalled how these discussions sometimes became so intense that the prisoners would forget where they were, their voices rising with passion until a guard's approach forced them back to silence. They developed an elaborate system for sharing insights, quotes written on scraps of toilet paper and passed during meals, key passages memorized and recited during work details, coded references that allowed them to continue conversations across different contexts. The Grapes of Wrath taught Mandela crucial lessons about leadership, social change, and the psychology of oppression that would shape his approach for the rest of his life. These weren't abstract insights, but practical wisdom forged in the crucible of his own suffering and tested against the experiences of his fellow prisoners. Lesson 1. The necessity of hope as revolutionary practice. Steinbeck's novel could easily have been purely tragic, a story of good people destroyed by evil systems. Instead, it's fundamentally about the active cultivation of hope under impossible circumstances. Majoad's famous declaration, "They ain't gonna wipe us out. Why, we're the people, we go on," became a touchstone for Mandela's philosophy. But this wasn't passive optimism. The novel showed how hope must be consciously maintained through daily acts of solidarity, mutual aid, and collective memory. The migrants survive not by individual strength but by creating communities that preserve dignity even in degradation. They share scarce resources, protect each other's children, maintain rituals that affirm their humanity. Mandela recognized that his 27-year imprisonment was fundamentally an attempt to break his hope and that of his movement. The apartheid regime calculated that long enough isolation would produce compliance, that broken spirits would accept injustice as natural. His response, partly inspired by Steinbeck's characters, was to make hope a form of resistance. Every day that he maintained his vision of a free South Africa, every time he refused to accept lesser offers of freedom in exchange for political compromise, was an act of revolutionary hope. Lesson 2. Understanding the enemy's psychology. One of the novel's most sophisticated insights concerns how oppressive systems depend on the complicity of ordinary people. The tractor driver who destroys the Jode family's home is their neighbor, apologetic but trapped by his own economic desperation. The police who break strikes are working-class men protecting capital interests that ultimately exploit them too. The small farmers who hate the migrants are themselves being squeezed by the same corporate forces. This analysis helped Mandela understand apartheid's psychological warfare. The system wasn't maintained only by evil racists but by ordinary white South Africans who had been taught to fear black advancement, to see their security as dependent on black subjugation. Many of the prison guards, Mandela realized, were poor Afrikaners whose own families had suffered during British colonial rule. Their racism was real and harmful, but it was also a product of systematic miseducation designed to serve elite interests. This insight would prove crucial to Mandela's later approach to reconciliation. Rather than simply condemning white South Africans as irredeemably racist, he began to see them as fellow victims of a system that corrupted everyone it touched. This didn't excuse their participation in oppression, but it suggested that transformation rather than revenge might be possible. Lesson 3. The long view of social change. Steinbeck's novel operates on multiple timescales. The immediate story covers a few years of the Jode family's migration, but the book constantly references longer historical patterns: the theft of land from Native Americans, the cycles of boom and bust in American capitalism, the recurring patterns of labor exploitation. The migrants are part of a much larger historical movement that will ultimately transform American society. This long-term perspective became essential to Mandela's strategic thinking. The apartheid regime wanted him to focus on immediate grievances that might might be addressed through minor reforms. Instead, Mandela learned to see the liberation struggle as part of a global historical movement toward human dignity and equality. Setbacks were temporary. The direction of history favored justice, but only if people were willing to struggle across generations. This perspective helped Mandela maintain morale during the darkest periods of imprisonment, when the liberation movement seemed crushed and international attention had moved elsewhere. Like Steinbeck's Migrants, he was part of something larger than his individual fate. Lesson 4. The centrality of economic justice. Perhaps most importantly, The Grapes of Wrath taught Mandela that political freedom without economic transformation was hollow. The novel shows how formal rights become meaningless when people lack the economic power to exercise them. Migrants had the legal right to travel and seek work, but practical constraints, lack of money, transportation, information, and social networks made those rights largely theoretical. This lesson would prove crucial to Mandela's post-release leadership. While many liberation movements focused primarily on achieving political power, Mandela insisted that political liberation must be accompanied by economic transformation. The Freedom Charter's commitment to redistributing wealth and resources reflected Steinbeck's influence as much as traditional socialist thinking.
When Nelson Mandela walked out of Victor Verster prison on February 11, 1990, he carried with him not just his own experiences of 27 years in captivity, but the accumulated wisdom of every book that had sustained him, every discussion that had sharpened his thinking, every insight that had deepened his understanding of human nature and social change. The Grapes of Wrath had been one of his most important teachers, and its lessons would profoundly shape how he approached the challenges of transforming South Africa from apartheid state to democratic society. The philosophy of reconciliation. Mandela's approach to reconciliation, perhaps his greatest contribution to human civilization, bore the clear influence of Steinbeck's humanistic vision. Just as The Grapes of Wrath refused to demonize even those who participated in oppressive systems, Mandela rejected the politics of revenge in favor of what he called a rainbow nation. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission, established under Mandela's presidency and chaired by Archbishop Desmond Tutu, embodied principles that Mandela had first encountered in Steinbeck's novel. Rather than focusing on punishment, it emphasized restoration of dignity, acknowledgement of suffering, and the creation of a shared narrative that could serve as the foundation for a new society. When perpetrators of apartheid-era crimes appeared before the commission, Mandela saw not irredeemable monsters but human beings who had been corrupted by an evil system, much like the small farmers in Steinbeck's novel who had been turned against the migrants by economic desperation and propaganda. This didn't excuse their crimes, but it suggested that transformation was possible if people were given the opportunity to confront the truth about their actions and their consequences. Economic policy and social justice. Mandela's commitment to economic transformation reflected lessons learned from The Grapes of Wrath about the inseparable connection between political and economic freedom. The novel had shown him how formal rights became meaningless without the material conditions necessary to exercise them. The Reconstruction and Development Program, RDP, launched in the early years of democratic South Africa, bore clear traces of Steinbeck's influence. Its emphasis on job creation, land redistribution, housing, education and healthcare reflected an understanding that political liberation without economic transformation would leave the majority of South Africans in conditions similar to those endured by Steinbeck's migrants, formally free but practically constrained by poverty and lack of opportunity. Mandela's speeches during this period frequently echoed themes from the novel. At the 1994 presidential inauguration, he spoke of creating a society where never, never and never again shall it be that this beautiful land will again experience the oppression of one by another. This commitment to systemic transformation rather than merely changing who held power reflected Steinbeck's insight that superficial political changes could coexist with deeper economic oppression, labor relations and workers' rights. The novel's detailed portrayal of labor exploitation had a profound impact on post-apartheid South Africa's approach to workers' rights. The Labor Relations Act of 1995, passed during Mandela's presidency, included some of the most progressive protections for organized labor in the world. Mandela understood, partly through Steinbeck's teaching, that individual workers were powerless against organized capital, but that collective organization could create more balanced power relationships. The novel's scenes of strike-breaking, wage manipulation and worker intimidation had shown him how employers used divide-and-conquer strategies to maintain exploitative relationships. The post-apartheid government's support for trade unions, its commitment to collective bargaining, and and its recognition of the right to strike all reflected lessons learned from the Grapes of Wrath about the necessity of organized worker power in creating just societies, international relations and human rights. Mandela's approach to international relations also bore Steinbeck's influence. Just as the novel had shown him that oppression followed similar patterns across different contexts, he understood that the struggle for human dignity was global. His support for liberation movements in other countries, his criticism of human rights abuses regardless of which governments committed them, and his vision of South Africa as part of a larger community of nations all reflected the universalist vision he had first encountered in Steinbeck's work. When Mandela criticized the United States for its treatment of Cuba, or challenged the international community's response to conflicts in Africa, he was applying lessons about solidarity and mutual responsibility that he had learned from reading about the migrant camps of California. In our current era of growing inequality, mass migration, climate displacement, and resurgent authoritarianism, The Grapes of Wrath feels less like historical fiction and more like prophecy. The lessons that sustained Mandela in his darkest hours offer crucial guidance for anyone seeking to understand and respond to contemporary challenges. Understanding economic inequality. Today's wealth gap has reached levels not seen since the 1920s, the decade that preceded the events depicted in Steinbeck's novel. Once again, technological change and financial speculation are displacing traditional workers, concentrating wealth in fewer hands, and creating vast populations of economically insecure people. The novel's analysis of how economic systems create artificial scarcity while abundance exists helps explain contemporary puzzles: why poverty persists amid unprecedented global wealth, why technological advances often worsen rather than improve working conditions, why economic growth doesn't necessarily translate into human flourishing. Steinbeck showed that these outcomes aren't natural or inevitable, but result from specific policy choices and power relationships. This insight, that economic arrangements are political decisions rather than natural laws, remains revolutionary today. Recognizing propaganda and scapegoating. The novel's portrayal of how migrants were blamed for problems they didn't create offers a template for understanding contemporary scapegoating of immigrants, refugees, and other vulnerable populations. Just as California's economic elites blamed Okies for wage depression that actually resulted from their own policies, today's politicians often blame immigrants for economic problems caused by corporate decisions and government policies. Steinbeck showed how this scapegoating served specific interests. By directing anger at migrants rather than at the systems that created their desperation, elites could maintain exploitative relationships while avoiding accountability. The same dynamics operate today in debates about immigration, trade, and economic inequality. Building empathy across difference. One of the novel's greatest achievements is its success in humanizing people who were widely despised and dehumanized. The Okies were seen by many Americans as ignorant, lazy, and threatening, much as refugees and migrants are often portrayed today. Steinbeck's genius was showing the dignity, intelligence, and resilience of people who had been stripped of almost everything. This capacity to see humanity in the dehumanized, which Mandela learned and applied in his own context, is essential for building the coalitions necessary to address contemporary challenges. Whether the issue is homelessness, immigration, mental illness, or addiction, the first step toward effective action is recognizing the full humanity of people who are suffering, sustaining hope in dark times. Perhaps most importantly, The Grapes of Wrath teaches what Mandela called revolutionary hope, the active cultivation of vision and determination, even when immediate circumstances seem hopeless. The novel doesn't promise easy victories or quick solutions. Instead, it shows how people can maintain dignity and purpose, even in the face of systematic oppression. This lesson is crucial for contemporary activists and change makers who often feel overwhelmed by the scale of problems they're trying to address. Climate change, inequality, authoritarianism, and other global challenges can seem so massive that individual action feels pointless. Steinbeck's novel, filtered through Mandela's experience, offers a different perspective. Change happens through the accumulation of countless individual acts of courage, solidarity, and refusal to accept injustice as normal.
Reading The Grapes of Wrath with an understanding of its role in Mandela's development offers readers a unique opportunity for intellectual and moral growth. This isn't just about acquiring historical knowledge or literary appreciation. It's about developing the kind of consciousness that can respond effectively to injustice and suffering. Developing systems thinking. The novel teaches readers to look beyond individual stories to see underlying patterns and structures. When the Jode family loses their farm, it's easy to focus on their particular tragedy, but Steinbeck constantly zooms out to show how their experience fits into larger economic and historical patterns. This systems perspective perspective, which became central to Mandela's analysis of apartheid, helps readers understand contemporary problems more clearly. Individual instances of poverty, discrimination, or environmental destruction make more sense when seen as products of larger systems rather than isolated incidents. Cultivating historical consciousness, the novel demonstrates how present circumstances are shaped by historical forces that continue to operate. The migrants' suffering isn't just about natural disasters or individual bad luck. It's about ongoing patterns of land concentration, labor exploitation, and political manipulation that have deep historical roots. Mandela applied this historical consciousness to his understanding of apartheid, seeing it not as an aberrant system, but as the continuation of centuries of colonialism and racial capitalism. This perspective helped him understand both why the system was so entrenched and how it might ultimately be transformed. Building emotional resilience. One of the most practical benefits of reading the novel is learning how people can maintain hope and dignity under extreme pressure. The Joad family's strategies for preserving relationships, sustaining morale, and finding meaning amid chaos offer concrete lessons for anyone facing personal or social challenges. Mandela's own testimony about how the book sustained him during imprisonment demonstrates the power of literature to provide psychological resources for survival and resistance. In our own age of anxiety and uncertainty, these models of resilience are invaluable. Developing leadership philosophy, the novel's complex portrayal of leadership, from Pajadard's traditional authority to Madadard's adaptive strength to Tom Jard's emerging consciousness, offers insights for anyone in leadership positions. Different situations require different leadership styles, but all effective leadership requires the ability to see beyond immediate circumstances to larger purposes and possibilities. Mandadard's leadership philosophy, shaped partly by these literary examples, emphasized the importance of maintaining vision while remaining flexible about tactics, building coalitions across differences, and never losing sight of the ultimate goal of human dignity for all people. Enhancing communication skills. Steinbeck's novel demonstrates the power of storytelling to create understanding and empathy across social divisions. The book's impact on readers like Mandela shows how narrative can be a tool for social change, helping people see familiar situations from new perspectives. Learning to tell stories that illuminate rather than obscure social realities, stories that build bridges rather than walls, is an essential skill for anyone working for positive change. The novel provides a masterclass in how to use concrete, personal stories to illuminate abstract social and economic forces. As we reach the end of our journey through the Grapes of Wrath and its profound impact on Nelson Mandela, we arrive at a truth that transcends both the Great Depression and apartheid South Africa. This truth speaks to every generation that faces injustice, every individual who confronts systemic oppression, every community that struggles to maintain dignity in the face of dehumanization. Steinbeck's great insight, which Mandela carried with him from his prison cell to the presidency of a transformed nation, is that the struggle between human dignity and systematic oppression is eternal. It takes different forms in different eras: Dust Bowl displacement, apartheid segregation, contemporary inequality, but the fundamental dynamics remain constant. There will always be forces that seek to reduce human beings to mere economic units, to divide communities for the benefit of elites, to convince people that injustice is natural and permanent. But there will also always be people who refuse to accept these lies, like Marxjord declaring, "We're the people, we go on," like Mandela maintaining his vision of freedom through 27 years of imprisonment, like countless unnamed individuals who choose solidarity over selfishness and hope over despair. The novel's famous ending, Rose of Sharon, nursing a stranger's dying father with the milk intended for her own lost child, represents the ultimate triumph of human solidarity over the forces that seek to divide us. This act of radical compassion, performed by someone who has every reason to focus on her own survival, embodies the spirit that sustained both Steinbeck's Migrants and Mandela's liberation movement. Today, as we face our own versions of the challenges depicted in the Grapes of Wrath, mass displacement due to climate change, growing economic inequality, the rise of authoritarianism, the scapegoating of vulnerable populations, we need the lessons this novel taught Nelson Mandela. We need systems thinking that looks beyond individual symptoms to structural causes. We need historical consciousness that understands how past struggles connect to present challenges. We need revolutionary hope that sustains action even when immediate victories seem impossible. Most of all, we need the understanding that the struggle for human dignity is not a burden but a privilege. As
Tom Joad tells his mother in the novel's most famous passage, "Maybe all men got one big soul everybody's a part of." This recognition of fundamental human connection, which became central to Mandela's philosophy of Ubuntu, the African principle that I am because we are, offers the only sustainable foundation for building just societies. When Mandela walked free from prison and began the delicate work of transforming South Africa, he carried with him not just his own experiences but the accumulated wisdom of every story that had sustained him, every book that had deepened his understanding, every conversation that had sharpened his vision. The grapes of wrath had been one of his greatest teachers, showing him that individual suffering always has collective roots, that hope is a form of resistance, and that the arc of history bends toward justice only when people are willing to pull it in that direction. The book that comforted a prisoner became the philosophy that freed a nation. Tom Joad's spirit lives in every freedom fighter who refuses to accept that injustice is natural or permanent. Joad's resilience echoes in every community that maintains its humanity under impossible pressure, and Steinbeck's vision of fundamental human solidarity continues to inspire everyone who believes that a better world is possible. In Mandela's own words, spoken at his presidential inauguration, "Never, never and never again shall it be that this beautiful land will again experience the oppression of one by another." This wasn't just a promise about South Africa, it was a commitment to the ongoing human struggle for dignity, justice and mutual recognition that the grapes of wrath had taught him was both eternal and eternally worth fighting for. The grapes of wrath may ferment into the wine of revolution, but only if we're brave enough to tend the vineyard together. That's the lesson John Steinbeck offered to Nelson Mandela in a prison cell. That's the lesson Mandela carried into freedom and shared with the world. And that's the lesson we need now more than ever as we face our own challenges and write the next chapter of humanity's long walk to freedom. Which book gave you hope in your darkest moment? How do stories shape our understanding of justice? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let's continue the conversation that began in a prison cell and changed the world.